With Colorado somewhat amusingly crawling back to the Big 12, well, another funny idea has resurfaced that Missouri is the cause of all this conference realignment. Well, let's examine this notion and more coming up right now on Locked On Mizzou.
You are Locked On Mizzou, your daily podcast on the Missouri Tigers, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey, all you true sons and daughters, I'm John Miller, your Mizzou mafioso and the central scrutinizer of Missouri Tigers football and basketball. Thanks for making Locked On Mizzou your first listen every day. We're free and available wherever you get podcasts, including on YouTube and on the Sirius XM app, where you can also, of course, get all your Major League Baseball action, the Women's World Cup, just about any sport you could possibly imagine over on the Sirius XM app. But I got to tell you, once again, I am amused that so many people on the Twitter sphere throughout the sports landscape seem to think that realignment all started with big, bad old Missouri. And I got to say, I really wish that Mizzou were that important. I honestly do. I wish that we were the power brokers of college football. Now, I do want to make one thing really clear before we kind of get into this whole thing. I am very happy to be in the Southeastern Conference. I've talked about how, sometimes I do pine for the old Big Eight. I'm old enough to remember those rivalries. And to me, most importantly, I just love the actual structure of an 8-team league. I've gone over that enough in the past, so I won't repeat it for you here again. I do just want to make clear, though, that I'm not particularly upset. I mean, Missouri could not have gotten a better landing spot than the SEC. And it's not as though the old Big 8 or the old Big 12 in its original forms are ever coming back. So would I rather Missouri be in the Southeastern Conference in 2023 than anywhere else? You're darn right. But it sure seems like to me, though, I see a lot of people out there online. I even had a good, productive back and forth with a Missouri fan who disagreed with me a little bit too. But I've noticed so many people need to play the blame game and suggest, and to me that suggests that all of this may not be that great of an idea, that maybe all of us are not exactly satisfied with this new conference setup. Now, if you're an old style SEC or Big Ten fan, you probably don't care that much. But the rest of us, if you're a Big 12 fan, a Pac-12 fan, of course, Big East, ACC, has this been great for any of that? Has this been productive to, say, ruin the Oklahoma and Oklahoma State rivalry, break up several rivalries just like that, or at least delay them for a decade, that type of thing? How has this been good for the fans? That's kind of been my whole point here. But to the original point of this show, is realignment, is this Missouri's fault? Well, this has been a very convenient angle, and I would say narrative, for the Oklahoma and Texases and Nebraskas of the world, especially to take. Especially Nebraska would have told you this at the time, right? Like, oh, well, when Missouri said publicly, and by the way, Missouri saying publicly was actually specifically Governor Jay Nixon at the time. To me, as they say in the pro wrestling business, I think old Jay Nixon went into business for himself, because there was really no reason for him to actually come out and say, hey, it'd be pretty cool if Missouri went to the Big Ten, basically saying that, hey, there has been some talk, some backdoor channeling, overtures, whatever you want to call it, between Missouri and that conference at the time. I have no doubt that that was true, by the way. I'm sure Jay Nixon was telling the truth. Obviously, the governor of the state is going to be very locked into what's happening with the flagship public institution of his state. So I'm sure he had a great idea of what was going on behind the scenes. But of course, as we remember, ultimately Missouri did not go to the Big Ten. But again, the point is, since Jay Nixon went public with this, since he basically shot off at the mouth, well, now it's really convenient for all the schools that were quiet during this period, like Nebraska specifically, to say, oh, well, gee, we weren't talking about conference realignment, because no one from that institution or the government actually came out and said was frankly dumb enough to come out and basically put his foot in his mouth and talk about a deal that had not been done yet. Yes, the famous phrase, Missouri to the Big Ten, a done deal. Well, clearly it was not a done deal in retrospect. And again, if Missouri was so powerful, if they were so utterly powerful, then why didn't the Big Ten ultimately take Missouri? That would be my first question. And secondly, and really this is more my big point, there's just no way that Missouri was the only team at that time that was at least sending out feelers about, hey, where could we possibly land here in a new conference? If you notice, the last two big moves the last couple years here have, of course, been USC and UCLA taking off to the Big Ten, and also, well, Oklahoma and Texas moving to the SEC. Well, what did both of those moves have in common in terms of the reporting? Well, basically, there was a report out there about both of those moves from, I can't even remember who reported it, Pete Thamel perhaps, doesn't really matter. Some big national person had the big news, had the sources, all that stuff, but that was like a day or two from my memory, literally within days of the news being announced officially by those institutions. It wasn't this year and a half long process of rumors and innuendo and all this stuff like the first time around from conference realignment about a dozen years or so ago at this point. No, institutions learned, I think, from Missouri to go, hey, wait a second, maybe we should play this stuff closer to the vest. And frankly, I think most institutions were very aware at the time to play closer to the vest. I think the Missouri administration, for all of its faults over the years and at the time specifically, I think if Jay Nixon doesn't shoot off at the mouth there, who knows if we're even aware of any type of substantial Big Ten courting Missouri, those type of rumors, if those would have even gotten out whatsoever. Again, UCLA, USC, did anybody have any idea that was going to happen until a few days before the news was official, essentially? The point is, there's no way that just that week, suddenly USC and UCLA picked up the phone, called the Big Ten, and was like, hey, what do you guys think about taking us into the conference? The wheels for that particular move had been in motion for months, if not years. Almost certainly this had been talked about for years, again, in the figurative smoke-filled rooms of UCLA and Big Ten and all the big power brokers involved in those decisions. Again, I wish Missouri were as powerful as everybody likes to make them out to be. I don't think anybody actually thinks this for the most part. They might tell themselves this to lie to themselves for whatever reason. But the reality is everybody knows that Missouri is not the power broker here. And quite honestly, let's say the SEC wasn't interested in Missouri. What happens? Well, I pretty much guarantee you that SEC ends up taking another team, whoever the heck it might be. Let's say it's not going to be Oklahoma State, but let's say it's Kansas. Who cares? Whatever Big 8 team, whatever ACC team, maybe it's North Carolina State, maybe it's Florida State. Doesn't matter. All I'm saying is the rest of the structure of the SEC would have been the same. It would have had nothing to do with Nebraska moving to the Big Ten. It would have had nothing to do with Colorado's moves back and forth. It had nothing to do with Oklahoma and Texas ultimately jumping a decade later. USC, UCLA, the whole thing. Just the idea that Missouri was like the first domino, and without that domino, well, maybe we're just sitting in the same place as we were a dozen years ago. It's frankly preposterous. And if you just follow through with the logic of it for just a little while, you'll realize that I'm correct. And Dennis Gates and Missouri's 2024 high school class got off to a nice start, in my opinion, with the addition of T.O. Barrett, but it sure sounds like the rest of the class is going to be strong as well, including what could possibly be a very literally a big target, 6'10", 305-pound young man from Marietta, Georgia. So I want to talk about that recruit coming up. But I'll tell you, these days, every potential new hire, if you're a small business, and I know this from experience, feels like a high stakes gamble. You want to be 100% certain that you have access to the best qualified candidates available. Well, that's why you got to check out LinkedIn Jobs. They help you find the right people for your team faster and for free. And again, from experience, I know that frankly, when you hire the wrong person, it can be a gigantic headache. Well, when you hire the right person, oh, it just makes your life that much easier. You can't wait to pay that person at the end of the week. Well, and with simple screening tools, you know what? That's going to make it easy for you to focus on exactly the candidates with the skills you want and the experience that you need. Quickly prioritize exactly who you want to interview. That's why small businesses like mine rate LinkedIn Jobs #1 in delivering quality hires versus their leading competitors. So post your job for free at linkedin.com/lockedoncollege. That's linkedin.com/lockedoncollege to post your job for free. LinkedIn Jobs helps you find the qualified candidates you want to talk to faster and for free. Terms and conditions apply. Thanks for making Locked On Mizzou your first listen every day. And for you everydayers, coming up next week on the show, we've got real football practice. Anyways, yes, we're going to talk about practice. Whatever happens next week, we should have some real news, although this time of year, probably no news is good news for the most part. But no matter what happens, I'll be breaking it down for you right here on the Locked On Mizzou podcast feed. But speaking of the Tigers, of course, I want to talk basketball here a little bit and some really just encouraging news, rumors, innuendo, whatever you want to call it, from Gabe DeArmond over at Power Mizzou this morning. Obviously not going to give away all of his information for free or anything like that, but just suffice it to say, if you're a Missouri fan, you should be really excited about basketball right now. If last season wasn't enough to convince you, well, it sure seems like Dennis Gates, after establishing that he can really coach last season, not only with the product on the court, but being able to, well, hopefully vault a couple guys into the NBA, and Demoy Hodge and Kobe Brown, of course, will certainly be making the Clippers this coming fall. So some really positive examples of development there. And it seems like, well, the high school players are taking notice. And by the way, Gates and Charlton Young, two of the guys probably most responsible for most of the best players who were at Florida State prior to Gates arriving at Cleveland State a few years ago. Well, number one, also another interesting thing to note here, I will point out one name here, Peyton Marshall from Marietta, Georgia, a guy who was previously committed to Auburn in this recruiting cycle, is now very much available, and it's quite possible that Missouri will get him. He's very much, sounds like the Tigers are in the last 2 or 3 for his services. The guy who originally recruited Marshall to Auburn is now at Ole Miss. So the thought is maybe Missouri and Ole Miss are the final two. We shall see. But to me, the most interesting part of this is for all the Missouri fans who are maybe thinking after last season that, boy, Dennis Gates really hates size. Well, I guess getting Connor Vanover, all 7'3" of him, is probably an indication that Gates likes some size. But obviously Vanover, not the biggest, thickest guy in the world, more of a stretch 5 offensively these days. Well, Peyton Marshall looks to be more in the Jeremiah Tillman mold, at least at first glance, at 6'10", 305 pounds out of high school. Not a lot of fat on him either. That's a young man right there. So the 83rd best player in the country, the 10th best center in the country, according to Rivals.com. Once again, if you thought Dennis Gates was afraid of size or against size, something like that, I think a lot of his recruiting upcoming and then this past cycle as well, our true freshmen that'll be on the squad this year, you're going to see plenty of height on Missouri going forward, but also skill too. That's the thing that Dennis Gates does not seem to compromise on whatsoever. But overall, just in addition to Peyton Marshall, a bunch of really strong names that Gabe DeArmond mentions in his piece. Again, go over to powermizzou.com to check it out. But it's all a bunch of top 50, top 100 national type guys, which is a great place for Missouri and Dennis Gates to be sitting in year two. I'm really impressed with everything that Gates has done, obviously, so far, not just at Missouri in year one, but at Cleveland State, too. I mean, seriously, you go back and look at what he did in 3 short years at Cleveland State. It's unbelievably impressive. And the fact that he was able to do it again in Missouri this short period of time already, to me, has established him as one of the premier coaches in the sport. So Missouri's really lucky to have him, and we better hang on to him with both hands. That's for darn sure. And coming up, I've been teasing for a little while about how there is crying in football. And while doing some research on crying in football, I, of course, had to check out the Larry Smith era, right? One of the great criers of all time, without question. Well, that led me to the 1997 Nebraska game. And also, I want to talk about crying and how great that football game was. Believe it or not, my 14-year-old self did not cry after that game, but I was not very happy. That's for darn sure. Despite that, though, the more I go back and watch that game over the years, to me, I think it may be the greatest Missouri football game of all time, despite the ending. So you know what? I'm going to make that case. But first, I want to make the case that eBay Motors is the right place for you, because for a championship team, it's all about making sure every player is a great fit. It's the same when it comes to your vehicle. Every part needs to fit just right. So the next time you need parts and accessories, head to eBay Motors. With eBay Guaranteed Fit, you can be sure every part you need fits right the first time around. All you have to do is just add your vehicle to My Garage and look for the green check mark to know the part will fit, or you get your money back. Because just like in sports, confidence is the name of the game when you shop on eBay Motors. And with over 122 million parts to choose from, you'll be back in the game in no time. After all, it's easy to bring home a win when the right parts are guaranteed. So get the right parts, the right fit, and the right prices on ebaymotors.com. Let's ride. eBay Guaranteed Fit, only available to U.S. customers, eligible items only, exclusions apply. You know what? If you think I'm crazy for loving the 1997 Nebraska game so much, I can't really blame you at all whatsoever. In fact, my co-host on my old podcast, For Old Missouri, go ahead and search for the 1997 rewatch I did with my buddy Blake Stark. Well, Blake was definitely not with me on loving that game as much. I think we had a lot of fun doing that recap for sure, but the ending was just too much for him. And listen, I totally get it, but I'm saying if you just actually take an objective look at it, if you can sort of remove your Missouri fandom just a tiny bit, or even lean into your Missouri fandom and just realize what a magical afternoon and then evening of college football that was. Because listen, again, this is not an argument I'm really wanting to have with anybody. If you feel differently, if you feel like, hey, the Oklahoma game from 2010 was better, the 2007 KU game, I'm not going to argue with you whatsoever. I'm just telling you that fall afternoon in Columbia in 1997 was the most magical day of college football I've ever seen in my entire life. And here's why. You got to remember, I'm 40 years old. So back in 1983, well, that was in fact Missouri's last bowl appearance until 1997. So a program that had been somewhat resurrected, for sure, a fan base that had suddenly been energized for the first time in over a decade, I would say. Because even you go back to the 5th down game, right, where Missouri almost pulled off the upset of the ultimate national champions. Well, that was really a pretty terrible football game in front of maybe, I don't know, a 2/3 full Faurot Field that day. I don't know. Maybe somebody can correct me. I'm wrong and tell me it was a sellout. I don't know. All I can tell you was the OmniTurf back then was terrible. It was a sloppy, bad football game that, yeah, would have been nice if Missouri would have won it. But at the same time, it wouldn't have really changed anything. Missouri would have still been not very good that season, and ultimately Bob Stoll would have still probably lost his job. I don't think it really changes that much in the long run. But in 1997, though, Missouri came into that game, again, looking to have its first bowl game in forever. I mean, I'm 14 years old at the time. All I've ever known as a Missouri fan is Norm Stewart racking up a bunch of victories on the basketball court and the football team, frankly, being a joke. So to see Missouri come in there with a game plan, with a similar game plan to what Nebraska, the mighty Nebraska Cornhuskers at the time, I believe they had won 2 national championships leading into this season, winning another share in this 1997 season. The idea that Missouri could compete with this team as 29-point underdogs at home, it just seemed like too much. It really did. But on this afternoon, Missouri did absolutely everything right, it seemed. Of course, they established that running game with their big Missouri homegrown offensive line, those fullbacks like Ron Janes from Clarence, Missouri, and Ernest Blackwell, and of course the backs, and of course, Corby Jones, who was just frankly heroic in a lot of moments in this ball game. And that actually gets me to Larry Smith and the crying. Yes, I'm going to bring it all together here, folks, because there's a moment in that game, late in the game, Missouri scores its final touchdown, takes a late lead in that ball game in the fourth quarter, where Corby Jones breaks, contains, scrambles, dives across like backwards basically, and reaches across the goal line and takes a brutal hit to the back essentially by the Nebraska player. I mean, just gets absolutely rocked, gives up his body for the touchdown. Missouri scores, takes the lead. It is by far and away the loudest crowd to that point I've ever heard in the history of Faurot Field. I'm saying me. At that, like, it's not even close. There's never been an atmosphere like that in my 14 years as a fan at that point. And at that moment, a tear comes down the eye of Larry Smith. And Brent Musburger says, if I didn't know any better, I think there's a tear in Larry Smith's eye. Well, you know what? Watching that back yesterday, if I didn't know any better, I think there might have been a tear in my eye too, because that just brought me right back to my childhood. It really did. Just a truly magical day of college football. If you want to see an upset, if you want to see a true underdog kind of story, it doesn't really get any better than this game, except for the ending. The ending is still, to this day, absolutely unbelievable. And not only did Nebraska, of course, the famous flea kicker play on the very last play of regulation. We all know what happened. We all know a bunch of Missouri fans in the north end zone rushed the field and were grabbing onto literally hanging from the goalposts. They thought Missouri had won this football game. That's how absurd this moment was. So to have that happen, for Missouri to lose that way, I totally understand how heartbreaking it was. Believe me, I was there. I couldn't believe what I saw. I was basically catatonic for about the next 2.5 hours or so. But anyway, I'm just telling you, though, as a fan of college football and, 26 years removed now, it's still just something that I go back and remember so many of those moments from that game as crystal clear as that final play in regulation. And it's just too bad. And you forget that last drive of regulation too. Nebraska had to pick up at least 1 or 2 long 3rd and 10s. The Missouri pass rush at that point, the defense in general, just seemed completely spent by the end of the ball game. There was a ball batted up in the air at one point that Al Sterling nearly picked off the Missouri linebacker. So just so many ifs, ands, buts, woulda, couldas, and shouldas. But ultimately, the atmosphere of that game, the surreal nature of a sort of moribund football program. I just had heard my entire life my dad talk about, oh, well, you should have seen Missouri what it was like during the 60s and the 70s. And, well, it just felt like on that day in 97, it felt like a resurrection. And that while that resurrection was maybe a little bit short-lived under Larry Smith, boy, 97 and 98 were a lot of fun and definitely set the table for the Pinkel years that were to come. So, you know what? Thanks a lot for indulging me on this trip down memory lane here on Locked On Mizzou. Hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. And for you everydayers, again, football practice starting next week. So our long nightmare of the offseason is just about to officially come to a close. And again, no matter what happens, again, no news is good news this time of year, but no matter what happens, we'll take it as it comes right here on Locked On Mizzou.